Picture this. You're barefoot on limestone, still warm from the afternoon sun. The air smells like burnt incense and dry dust. Around you, a small crowd stands in dead silence, heads bowed, while a priest raises a bronze rod shaped like a coiled serpent. This isn't just any object. For these people, in this exact moment, it's the only thing standing between life and death. We're somewhere in the desert, more than 3,000 years ago, and what you just witnessed, as contradictory as it sounds, is an act of worship toward a snake. Yes, the same creature that would later become, in the tradition that grew out of this very culture, the oldest symbol of deceit and evil in the Western world. Strange, right? Before we go further, you're going to want to understand why, because what's coming next complicates the simplified version most of us grew up learning about this symbol. And if this kind of historical contradiction hooks you the way it hooks me, stick around, because we dig one up every week on this channel. Think about it for a second from your couch, phone in hand, maybe with a plush snake toy in your nephew's room, because it was in some cartoon. For us today, the snake is basically a cliché. The Disney villain, the emoji you send when someone's being shady, the tattoo that's supposed to look intimidating. But for the people walking barefoot through that desert I just described, that same image wasn't decoration or a warning label. It was medicine. It was protection. It was a direct line to forces they couldn't control. The irony is that we inherited the fear and lost almost all of the reverence that created it in the first place. Let's start with the question in the title. Why does the snake show up tied to evil, deception, or chaos in so many religious traditions around the world? In Genesis chapter 3, the serpent talks Eve into eating the forbidden fruit and gets cursed to crawl on its belly forever. In Mesopotamian mythology, much older than the biblical text, the god Marduk has to defeat Tiamat, pictured as a primordial serpent or dragon of chaos, just to bring order to the universe. In ancient Egypt, Apophis, sometimes spelled Apep, is the giant serpent that tries to devour the sun every single night and drag the world into eternal darkness. Egyptian priests carried out specific rituals, recorded in what's known as the Book of Overthrowing Apophis, just to keep him at bay. In Norse mythology, there's Jormungandr, the serpent that encircles the entire world and is fated to fight Thor at Ragnarok. And in Hinduism, though the relationship with serpents is a lot more layered, as we'll get into, there's also Vritra, the serpent who holds back the world's waters until the god Indra defeats him to release life itself. Notice the pattern? Cultures that never had any contact with each other, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all landed on a snake, or something snake-shaped, as the face of original chaos, the obstacle that has to be beaten before order can exist. That's not a coincidence, and this is exactly where science steps into a religious conversation, which honestly I find fascinating. Primatologist Lynne Isbell at UC Davis published a book in 2009 called The Fruit, the Tree, and the Serpent, laying out what's now called snake detection theory. Isbell's argument: for millions of years, our primate ancestors shared territory with venomous snakes, and the ones with sharper vision for spotting them in the underbrush were simply more likely to survive and pass on their genes. Over time, that constant vigilance got wired almost instinctively into the human brain. Later, experimental psychology backs this up. A 2008 study by Vanessa LoBue and Judy DeLoache, published in Psychological Science, found that even babies just a few months old pick out images of snakes faster than images of other objects, long before anyone's taught them to be afraid. In other words, the fear of snakes might not have started in a temple or a sacred text. Religion may have simply put a name and a story to a fear we already came preloaded with. But here's the part almost every other video on this topic skips right past. If the fear of snakes were purely universal and instinctive, every culture should have turned it into a villain. And that is simply not what happened. Let's talk about the exceptions, because they're massive, and they dismantle the idea, repeated constantly online, that the snake is evil across nearly every world religion. In Mesoamerica, the snake wasn't chaos to be destroyed. It was wisdom and creation itself. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent worshipped by the Toltecs, the Mexica, and other peoples, was one of the most important gods in the pantheon, tied to knowledge, wind, and life itself. His main temple at Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent, still stands today, covered in carved images of this creature, not as a threat, but as a creator god. In Hinduism, the Nagas are semi-divine serpent beings who inhabit an underground realm full of treasure, and while some texts paint them as dangerous, many others show them as guardians, bringers of fertility, and protectors of water. Temples across South India still honor them today at carved stones called Nagakals. In Buddhism, tradition holds that while the Buddha meditated under a tree and a storm threatened to interrupt him, it was Mukalinda, king of the serpents, who spread his hood to shield him from the rain, a scene carved into countless statues across Southeast Asia. And in ancient Greece, the philosophical birthplace of much of Western thought, the serpent coiled around a staff was the symbol of Asclepius, the god of medicine, an emblem so powerful it still appears today on the logos of medical organizations and ambulances around the world. Fun fact, that staff gets mixed up all the time with the caduceus of Hermes, which has 2 snakes instead of 1. But the underlying symbolism points the same direction either way: healing, not condemnation. And there are even more examples that almost never come up when this topic gets discussed online. In Egypt, the same civilization that feared Apophis as a force of chaos, people simultaneously worshipped Wadjet, the cobra goddess who protected the pharaoh and appeared carved directly on his crown, right above the forehead, ready to spit fire at any enemy. In other words, within a single culture, the snake could be both the monster threatening to swallow the sun and the divine guardian protecting the most powerful ruler in the kingdom. And in Gnostic tradition, a circular symbol called the Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail, forming a perfect circle, represented nothing less than eternity, the endless cycle of destruction and rebirth of the entire universe. That same symbol shows up in Egyptian texts as old as the so-called Book of the Hidden Chamber, found in Tutankhamun's tomb, and resurfaces almost unchanged centuries later in medieval European alchemy. A detail that, honestly, is more impressive than anything in whatever mystery series you binged until 2 a.m. last week. Here's where it gets strange, and a lot more interesting than the snake was always evil. Anthropologist Balaji Mundkur, in his 1983 book, The Cult of the Serpent, argued something that a lot of later researchers picked up on. Because snakes shed their skin, ancient cultures across the world read that as a symbol of renewal, of eternal life, even of fertility, a creature that appears to shed its old body and emerge renewed. Think about it. For an agricultural civilization obsessed with the cycles of planting, harvest, and the death of the land, that didn't sound threatening. It sounded divine. So, if the snake started out as a symbol of life and wisdom in so many places, when and why did it become synonymous with betrayal and evil in the traditions most familiar to us today, like the Judeo-Christian one? This is where something almost never mentioned in quick explainer videos comes in: politics and religious competition. Archaeologists, including William Dever, a specialist in biblical archaeology, have documented that the Canaanite cults surrounding the early Israelites featured serpent imagery tied to fertility goddesses like Asherah. At sites like Tel Bir Sheba and across Judah, archaeologists have found figurines and objects with snake motifs dating to the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. In other words, the snake was already a powerful religious symbol in the region. It just belonged to the neighboring religions that emerging monotheism was actively trying to replace. And one very old, very effective rhetorical move to discredit your neighbor's god is to turn their sacred symbol into the villain of your own origin story. Religion, like politics, has always known how to recycle someone else's symbols and flip them upside down. In fact, the Hebrew tradition itself contains an episode that confirms this ambiguity in an almost uncomfortable way. In the book of Numbers, chapter 21, we're told that Moses, on divine instruction, builds a bronze serpent called Nehushtan and mounts it on a pole so that anyone bitten by a venomous snake in the desert could look at it and be healed. That same image, the rod with the coiled serpent I described at the start of this video, was kept and venerated for generations, until, according to 2 Kings chapter 18, King Hezekiah ordered it destroyed because people had started worshiping it like an idol. Sit with that paradox for a second. The exact same symbol that represents original deception in Genesis becomes, just a few books later, the literal instrument of divine salvation. Even within a single religious tradition, the snake couldn't be pinned to one moral side. Which brings us to the question everyone eventually asks once they dig deeper into this topic. If the snake was a healer, a protector, a symbol of wisdom and eternal life across so many cultures, including, at times, the Bible itself, why did the negative version end up winning out almost globally? Historian of religion Mircea Eliade offered an answer worth sitting with. Snakes, more than representing evil in themselves, represented the threshold, the boundary between worlds, between life and death, between the conscious and the unknown, between order and whatever hasn't taken shape yet. And every threshold, in every culture, produces fascination and fear at the same time. It's no accident that each religious tradition ends up resolving that ambivalence in its own way, depending on what story it needed to tell about itself at that moment in history. Think about something as ordinary as the skull and crossbones symbol we still use today to mark dangerous products on a store shelf. That same visual alarm, that automatic reaction we get towards something that can kill us, but, in the right dose, can also heal us. That's the exact same tension that sustained snake worship for thousands of years. We never stopped feeling that ambivalence. We just changed the packaging. We swapped the temple for the pharmacy shelf, and the priest for the warning label. Mythologist Joseph Campbell, famous for comparing mythologies across the entire planet, argued that the snake is probably the oldest and most widespread symbol in the whole history of human religion, older, even, than the human-shaped gods we're more familiar with today. At Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, and at Göbekli Tepe, the carved stone complex some archaeologists date to around 9,500 BCE, serpent imagery already appears on the stone pillars, thousands of years before any religious text we know of existed. We're possibly looking at the oldest continuously reused religious symbol humanity has ever held on to, reshaped again and again for whatever each society needed to explain: fertility, death, healing, chaos, forbidden knowledge. And maybe that's the real answer to the question we started with. The snake didn't become a symbol of evil because it was, objectively, more dangerous or more wicked than any other animal. It became evil in certain hugely influential and widespread traditions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam because it embodied something far more uncomfortable than an animal ever could: the possibility of knowledge that shouldn't be touched yet, the temptation to cross a threshold too soon. Meanwhile, in other traditions, just as old, just as deep, that same power to cross thresholds, to die and be reborn, to hold secrets, to heal wounds, stayed a reason for reverence instead of condemnation. Now go back for a second to that moment in the desert we opened with. You, barefoot, staring at that bronze rod shaped like a serpent, surrounded by people who never doubted its power to heal. Maybe, if you think about it, we've never actually left that spot, standing in front of something we don't fully understand, capable of hurting us or saving us, depending on how we choose to look at it. In the end, the snake was maybe never really about good or evil. It was always about us, that deeply human need to give a recognizable shape to fear and hope in the face of everything we don't fully control. And if this left you wanting to keep pulling on the threads connecting cultures this different from each other, you already know where to find the next piece of the puzzle.